October 3rd, 1951. 0534 hours. White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. The Corporal missile sits on its launch pad, 35 feet of experimental fury pointed at the pre-dawn sky. In the blockhouse, 400 yards away, Dr. Werner von Braun watches the countdown clock with growing dread. T-minus 2 minutes. The fuel mixture in that rocket, a volatile combination of red fuming nitric acid and aniline, cost $47,000 to produce. It took 6 weeks to manufacture at the Army's chemical facility in Huntsville. It's the 5th test of this particular propellant formula, and if it fails like the previous 4, the entire Corporal program faces cancellation. The Army has lost patience. Congress has lost patience. And von Braun has run out of solutions. The Corporal is supposed to be America's answer to the German V-2, a mobile battlefield missile that can deliver a 1,500-pound warhead 75 miles downrange. But the fuel keeps decomposing. The nitric acid oxidizes too quickly. The aniline breaks down at desert temperatures. By the time the missile launches, the propellant mixture has lost 23 of its energy density. Result: the missile falls 18 miles short of target, tumbles out of control, or in one spectacular case, explodes on the pad, taking $2.3 million worth of equipment with it. T-minus 90 seconds. Von Braun turns to Colonel Harold Turner, the Army Ordnance Officer overseeing the program. If this fails, Harold, we have no backup formulation. The chemical engineers have exhausted every stabilization method. Turner's jaw tightens. Then we better pray this works, Werner. Because if it doesn't, Redstone Arsenal is shutting down your entire operation. What neither of them knows, what nobody in that blockhouse knows, is that 140 miles north, in a farmhouse outside Socorro, New Mexico, a 52-year-old cattle rancher named Earl Jenkins has already solved their problem. What they don't know is that Jenkins, who barely finished 8th grade and whose only chemistry knowledge comes from mixing livestock feed, has figured out how to stabilize rocket propellant using ingredients from his barn. What they don't know is that his crazy fertilizer mix, the one his neighbors laugh about, contains the exact chemical combination that will save the Corporal program, revolutionize American rocketry, and power the missiles that will win the space race. And what they definitely don't know is that in exactly 9 days, Jenkins is going to walk through the gates of White Sands Proving Ground, carrying a mason jar of yellowish liquid, and change the course of the Cold War. But right now, at T-minus 60 seconds, von Braun is watching his 5th test rocket prepare to fail, and he has no idea that salvation smells like cattle feed and comes from a man whose hands are permanently stained with dirt. To understand why America's rocket fuel crisis was so catastrophic, you need to understand how desperately unprepared the United States was for the Cold War arms race. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. Army captured German rocket technology and brought von Braun's team to America. The Soviets did the same with their captured scientists. The race was on to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the first nation to solve the propulsion problem would dominate the nuclear age. The challenge wasn't building rockets. The Germans had proven rockets worked with the V-2. The challenge was fuel. The V-2 used liquid oxygen and ethanol, a combination that worked but had fatal limitations. Liquid oxygen had to be stored at minus 297 degrees Fahrenheit. You couldn't keep a missile fueled and ready. You couldn't deploy it quickly. You had maybe 30 minutes between fueling and launch before the locks boiled away. For a battlefield weapon or an ICBM sitting in a silo waiting for war, that was useless. What the military needed was storable propellant. Fuel that could sit in a missile for weeks or months, ready to launch immediately, stable across temperature extremes from Alaskan winter to desert summer. The Germans had experimented with this near the war's end. They'd identified a promising combination, red fuming nitric acid as the oxidizer and aniline as the fuel. On paper, it was perfect. Energy density almost as good as LOX ethanol. Hypergolic, meaning it ignited on contact without a spark. Storable at normal temperatures. The combination that would power the next generation of American missiles. On paper. In reality, it was a disaster. The problem was stability. Red fuming nitric acid, chemical formula HNO3 with dissolved nitrogen dioxide, was viciously corrosive. It attacked metal tanks. It decomposed in sunlight. Temperature fluctuations caused pressure buildups. And when mixed with aniline too early, the combination degraded rapidly, losing thrust potential and sometimes detonating spontaneously. From 1946 to 1951, the best chemical engineers in America tried everything to stabilize storable propellants. Failed solution number 1, chemical inhibitors. Researchers at the Naval Research Laboratory tested 47 different additives to prevent nitric acid decomposition. Chromates, phosphates, organic acids, metallic salts. Cost of research program, $680,000. Results: most additives either didn't work or reduced fuel efficiency. The few that showed promise, like chromic acid, were too expensive for mass production. A single corporal missile would require 8,200 worth of inhibitor, making the program economically non-viable. Failed solution number 2, specialized storage containers. Engineers at Redstone Arsenal designed tanks using exotic alloys. Titanium, stainless steel 316, aluminum with ceramic linings. They tested rubber bladders, glass linings, even gold-plated containers. Cost per tank, $12,000 to $45,000. Problem: corrosion wasn't eliminated, just slowed. A missile's fuel load still degraded 18 to 25 over 4 weeks. And the specialized tanks were so expensive that each missile cost more than a B-29 bomber. Congress refused to fund mass production. Failed solution number 3, cryogenic maintenance systems. If you couldn't stabilize the fuel at normal temperatures, keep it cold. Redstone developed refrigeration units for missile storage. Constant 40 degrees Fahrenheit, controlled humidity, inert gas atmosphere. Cost of installation per missile site, $340,000. Problem: you defeated the entire purpose of storable propellant. The refrigeration systems required electrical power, maintenance crews, backup generators. You couldn't deploy missiles rapidly. You couldn't hide them. Soviet satellites could spot the massive refrigeration facilities from orbit. And if power failed during a crisis, your entire arsenal degraded within 72 hours. Failed solution number 4, rapid replacement doctrine. If fuel degraded, just replace it before launch. The Army tested quick drain and refill procedures. Trained crews could empty a corporal's tanks and reload fresh propellant in 38 minutes. Problem: where did the fresh fuel come from? You needed production facilities near every missile site. You needed constant supply convoys hauling volatile chemicals across the country. You needed waste disposal for degraded fuel. The logistics were impossible. And in wartime, supply chains would be targets. One bombing run on a fuel depot, and your missiles were useless. Failed solution number 5, alternative propellant combinations. Maybe nitric acid and aniline were just the wrong chemicals. Researchers tested dozens of alternatives. Nitrogen tetroxide with hydrazine, hydrogen peroxide with kerosene, chlorine trifluoride with various fuels. Some worked better for stability, but had other problems. Lower energy density, extreme toxicity, or in the case of chlorine trifluoride, the tendency to set concrete on fire and burn through sand. Dr. Raymond Stiff at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory wrote in his July 1950 assessment, We have tested every theoretically viable storable propellant combination within current chemical knowledge. The nitric acid aniline system remains our best option despite its stability problems. Until someone discovers fundamentally new chemistry, we are at an impasse. Translation: we're stuck with a fuel that doesn't work, and nobody knows how to fix it. The expert consensus, delivered at an October 1950 conference at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, was brutally pessimistic. Dr. Theodore von Karman, director of JPL and one of America's top rocket scientists, told the assembled military brass, "Gentlemen, storable propellant technology is 10 to 15 years away from operational viability. We lack the fundamental understanding of catalytic stabilization mechanisms. Current missile programs should accept high maintenance requirements or revert to cryogenic systems until chemical science advances." The Army couldn't wait 15 years. The Soviets were developing ICBMs. Intelligence reports suggested they'd solved storable propellant stability, though nobody knew how. Every month without a working American missile was a month the nuclear deterrent eroded. The pressure on von Braun's team at White Sands was immense. Test, fail, analyze, repeat. For corporal tests between January and September 1951. For failures, fuel degradation every time. And now test 5, October 3rd, 05:34 hours, T-minus 30 seconds, with the same problematic fuel formula because nobody had anything better. The corporal ignited, rose 200 feet. The engine flamed out. The missile tilted, fell, and impacted 1,800 yards from the pad. No explosion, just a crater and twisted metal. In the blockhouse, silence. Then Colonel Turner spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Werner, you have 30 days to solve this, or I'm recommending program termination." Von Braun nodded, already knowing he couldn't solve it. The best minds in rocketry had failed. What chance did he have? But 140 miles away, Earl Jenkins was feeding his cattle a special mixture he'd been perfecting for 7 years, and he was about to make a delivery that would change everything. Earl Everett Jenkins was born March 19, 1899, on a hardscrabble ranch outside Socorro, New Mexico. His father raised cattle and failed more often than he succeeded. Drought, disease, predators, the ranching life was brutal. Earl learned early that survival meant improvisation. You fixed what broke, you made do with what you had, and you paid attention to things that worked even if you didn't understand why. He attended school through 8th grade, leaving at 14 to work the ranch full-time after his father died. No high school, no college, no formal training in anything except hard work and observation. He married young, had 4 kids, took over the ranch, and spent 30 years doing what Western ranchers did. Losing money, barely surviving, and figuring out small tricks that made the difference between failure and hanging on one more year. One of those tricks involved fertilizer. Commercial fertilizer was expensive, sometimes $40 for a 50-pound bag, a fortune during the Depression. But cattle produced manure, lots of it, free fertilizer if you could make it work. Problem was, raw manure burned crops if you used too much. Nutrients leached away in rain. It didn't have the right nitrogen balance for New Mexico's alkaline soil. So Earl experimented. He mixed manure with other things. Wood ash from his stove, old hay, spoiled grain. He tried different ratios, different aging times. He'd spread test batches on different sections of his alfalfa field and see what grew best. No chemistry knowledge, no scientific method, just trial and error and careful observation. By 1944, Earl had developed what his neighbors called Jenkins's crazy cattle mix. Aged manure, wood ash, ammonium sulfate from the feed store, something he called his secret powder, which was actually saltpeter he got from a mining supply in Socorro, and molasses. Nobody knew why he added molasses. Earl said it helped the bacteria work better. His neighbors thought he was nuts. But Earl's alfalfa grew 30 better than anyone else's in the county. His cattle were healthier. And during the war, when commercial fertilizer disappeared, Earl's homemade mixture kept his ranch productive while others struggled. What Earl didn't know was that his crazy mix contained almost the exact chemical composition that rocket scientists were desperately seeking. The aged manure provided organic nitrogen compounds. The ammonium sulfate contributed inorganic nitrogen. The wood ash added potassium and trace minerals. The saltpeter, potassium nitrate, was a powerful oxidizer. And the molasses, it turned out, acted as a chelating agent, binding metal ions and preventing catalytic decomposition of nitrogen compounds. Earl had stumbled onto a sophisticated chemical buffer system that stabilized reactive nitrogen species. He thought he was just feeding his cows better. He'd actually invented a fuel stabilizer. The connection to rocketry happened by accident. In September 1951, Earl's nephew, Danny Martinez, came home from the Army. Danny had been stationed at White Sands as a supply clerk, no access to classified information, but he'd heard things. The rocket tests kept failing. Something about fuel problems. The scientists were frustrated. Danny mentioned this at Sunday dinner at Earl's ranch, mostly complaining about how all that government money was being wasted on rockets that didn't work when regular soldiers needed better equipment. Earl, half listening while carving a roast, asked the obvious question. What kind of fuel problems? Danny shrugged. Something about it going bad. Degrading, they called it. The rockets can't sit fueled up. The mixture breaks down, loses power. They keep trying different additives, but nothing works. Earl stopped carving. Looked up. Sounds like a nitrogen stability problem. Danny blinked. What? Nitrogen compounds break down when they're not balanced right. Happens with fertilizer all the time. You get too much oxidation, the nitrogen converts to forms plants can't use. You need buffers to keep it stable. Danny stared at his uncle. Earl, you're talking about rocket fuel, not fertilizer. Earl shrugged. Chemistry's chemistry, boy. Nitrogen's nitrogen. If their fuel's got nitrogen compounds going unstable, they need better buffering. What kind of additives are they using? I don't know. I'm a supply clerk, not a scientist. Earl went back to carving, but something nagged at him. Nitrogen stability. Oxidation prevention. That was exactly what his fertilizer mix solved. He'd spent years figuring out how to keep nitrogen compounds stable in New Mexico heat. Was rocket fuel really that different? Over the next week, Earl couldn't let it go. He drove to Socorro's small library, asked the librarian if they had any books about rocket fuel. She gave him a look. Earl, what on earth do you need rocket books for? Just curious. She found him 2 books, both from the war, basic stuff about V2s. Earl read them, struggling with the technical language, but he understood more than he expected. Liquid fuel rockets used oxidizers and reducing agents. Nitric acid was a common oxidizer. Aniline, an organic compound, was a common fuel. The problem was keeping them stable before mixing. Earl sat in his truck outside the library, mind racing. Nitric acid was nitrogen-based, highly oxidative, degraded in heat and light, exactly like the nitrogen problems in fertilizer. The stabilization challenge was the same: prevent unwanted oxidation, control reaction rates, buffer pH changes. And Earl had solved that problem for his cattle feed. He'd kept nitrogen compounds stable in 110-degree desert summers for weeks at a time. What if the same principles applied? It was a crazy thought. Earl was a rancher, not a chemist. But he'd built a career on trying crazy things that worked. He drove home, went to his barn, and stared at the jars of his fertilizer mixture. The base components, ammonium sulfate, saltpeter, chelated minerals from molasses. Could that stabilize rocket fuel? Only one way to find out. Earl didn't have access to nitric acid or aniline, but he had ammonium nitrate fertilizer from the feed store, which decomposed similarly. He set up a test. He dissolved ammonium nitrate in water, divided it into 6 jars. Jar 1, pure solution, no additives, his control. Jar 2, he added a spoonful of his fertilizer mix. Jar 3, just the saltpeter component. Jar 4, just the molasses component. Jar 5, saltpeter and molasses together. Jar 6, his complete mixture including trace minerals. He left all 6 jars on a shelf in his barn, in full sunlight, temperature climbing to 105 degrees during the day. He checked them every morning for 2 weeks. Jar 1, the control, turned cloudy within 3 days. By day 7, crystals were forming, nitrogen was precipitating out, the solution was degrading. Jar 2, his complete fertilizer mix, stayed clear. No cloudiness, no precipitation. By day 14, when Jar 1 was completely degraded and Jars 3 through 5 showed significant breakdown, Jar 2 and Jar 6 remained stable. His mixture worked. Not perfectly. Jar 6 was slightly better than Jar 2, suggesting the trace minerals mattered, but dramatically better than nothing. Earl sat in his barn, looking at those jars, and thought, I need to tell someone at White Sands. But who'd listen to a rancher? He called his nephew. Danny, can you get me a name? Someone at White Sands who deals with the fuel problem? Someone who might listen. Danny was skeptical. Uncle Earl, these are scientists. They've got PhDs. They're not going to listen to you about rocket fuel. Maybe, but I've got something that works. Can you at least get me a name? 2 days later, Danny called back. There's a civilian chemist named Dr. Robert Hendricks. He's the propellant stability specialist. Works directly under Von Braun. But Earl, you can't just walk up to White Sands. It's a military facility. You need clearance. Can you get me a phone number? On October 9, 1951, Earl Jenkins called White Sands Proving Ground and asked for Dr. Robert Hendricks. The operator was dubious. Sir, Dr. Hendricks is very busy. What is this regarding? Rocket fuel stabilization. There was a pause. Sir, are you with a defense contractor? No, I'm a rancher. I've got some ideas about the stability problem. I'm sorry, sir. Dr. Hendricks only takes calls from authorized personnel. If you have information, you can write to the General Inquiries Office. Earl hung up, frustrated. He tried 2 more times over the next 3 days. Same result. The military wasn't interested in calls from random ranchers. But Earl was stubborn. On October 12th, he loaded his truck with 3 mason jars, his test samples from the barn, a thermos of coffee, and his good hat. He drove the 140 miles to White Sands. At the main gate, an MP stopped him. State your business. I need to see Dr. Robert Hendricks. It's about the corporal fuel problem. The MP consulted a clipboard. Are you on the appointment list, sir? No, but I've got information he needs. I'm sorry, sir. No one enters without authorization. I can have you escorted to the visitor's center where you can file a request. Earl sat there, engine idling, knowing that going to a visitor's center meant bureaucracy, paperwork, weeks of runaround. He thought about those jars on his passenger seat, about the failed rocket test his nephew mentioned, about scientists with PhDs who'd spent 5 years failing to solve a problem he'd solved in his barn in 2 weeks. To hell with this, Earl muttered. He reached into his glove box, pulled out a piece of paper, and wrote, Dr. Hendricks, I can stabilize your nitric acid fuel using farm chemicals that cost $3 per gallon to produce. I have proof in my truck. Will you give me 10 minutes? Earl Jenkins, cattle rancher. He handed it to the MP. Can you get this to Dr. Hendricks? The MP read it, looked skeptical, but shrugged. Wait here. He walked to the guard shack, made a phone call. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Earl was about to leave when a Jeep pulled up. A thin man in civilian clothes climbed out, walked to Earl's truck window. Mr. Jenkins, I'm Dr. Hendricks. You claim you can stabilize nitric acid fuel with farm chemicals. Yes, sir. Prove it. Earl grabbed his mason jars, got out of the truck. This jar, he held up the cloudy one, is ammonium nitrate solution, been sitting in my barn for 2 weeks in direct sunlight. It's completely degraded. See the precipitation? This jar is the same solution with my additive mixture. Clear, stable, no degradation. Dr. Hendricks took the clear jar, held it up to the light, swirled it. What's your additive mixture? Combination of potassium nitrate, chelated minerals from molasses, ammonium sulfate in specific ratios, some trace compounds. I can write it down. Hendricks stared at him. You're a chemist? Cattle rancher. I make fertilizer. Nitrogen stability is the same problem whether it's rocket fuel or cattle feed. You keep nitrogen compounds from oxidizing too fast. You buffer pH swings. You chelate metal ions that catalyze decomposition. Hendricks blinked. And you figured this out how? Trial and error over 7 years trying to make cheap fertilizer work in desert heat. Sir, can I come in? Can I show your team this? Hendricks looked at the jars, looked at Earl, looked at the mason jars again. Against every regulation I can think of, yes. Get back in your truck. Follow that Jeep. Don't go anywhere except where they lead you. 30 minutes later, Earl Jenkins, cattle rancher, 8th grade education, was standing in a conference room at White Sands Proving Ground, facing 6 men with doctorates in chemistry and chemical engineering, and one very skeptical Dr. Werner von Braun. Explain your claim, Mr. Jenkins, von Braun said, his German accent still thick despite 6 years in America. Earl did. Simply, clearly, using the same logic that had made sense in his barn. You've got nitrogen compounds breaking down from oxidation and catalytic decomposition. You need to prevent both. Potassium nitrate acts as a stabilizer for nitric acid, provides a buffer against pH shifts. Molasses derivatives chelate metal ions, iron and copper, that catalyze degradation reactions. Ammonium sulfate controls the nitrogen balance. The ratios matter. Too much potassium and you get precipitation. Too little and you don't prevent oxidation. I spent 7 years finding the right ratios for fertilizer. Those same ratios should work for your fuel. Dr. James Harrison, chief propellant chemist, interrupted. Mr. Jenkins, with respect, we've tested over 200 additives. Chromates, phosphates, organic inhibitors, none have worked adequately. You're suggesting that farm fertilizer components will solve what Caltech, MIT, and JPL chemists haven't solved in 5 years? I'm suggesting that you've been overthinking it. You've tried exotic chemicals. I tried simple ones. Sometimes simple works. Harrison turned to von Braun. Werner, this is absurd. We don't have time for folk chemistry. Von Braun held up a hand. Dr. Hendricks, you saw his samples? Yes, sir. And they showed clear stability improvement? Yes, sir. Dramatically so. Von Braun turned back to Earl. Mr. Jenkins, can you provide your additive mixture for testing? Yes, sir. I've got the ratios written down. I can mix up a batch right now if you've got the ingredients. How much to treat 1 gallon of nitric acid? About 2 ounces of my mixture. Cost, maybe 15 cents worth of chemicals. The room went silent. Dr. Harrison finally spoke. 15 cents versus 8,200 for chromic acid treatment. If this works. Von Braun stood. We tested. Today, Dr. Hendricks set up a stability trial. Mr. Jenkins, you'll work with our chemists to prepare your additive mixture. Dr. Harrison, you'll supervise the testing with full skepticism. If this fails, we've lost 1 day. If it works, he paused. If it works, we've solved a 40 million problem with 15 cents of farm chemicals. What happened next compressed 5 years of research into 48 hours. Earl worked with the White Sands chemist to prepare his additive mixture. They measured, weighed, analyzed every component. Potassium nitrate, 40 by weight. Chelated minerals from blackstrap molasses, 25. Ammonium sulfate, 20. Trace components including magnesium and calcium compounds, 15. They mixed it precisely, then added it to red fuming nitric acid in carefully controlled ratios. 2 ounces per gallon. The test protocol was brutal. They prepared 12 samples. 4 with Earl's additive, 4 with the best current stabilizer, chromic acid, and 4 untreated controls. Each sample was divided. Half stored at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, ideal conditions. Half stored at 110 degrees in direct sunlight, worst-case desert scenario. They monitored every 6 hours for 72 hours, measuring nitrogen dioxide content, pH, corrosivity, energy density, and decomposition products. Hour 6, no significant difference. Hour 12, the controls at 110 degrees were showing degradation. Hour 18, the chromic acid samples at 110 degrees were starting to break down. Earl's samples, both temperatures, remained stable. Hour 24, control samples at 40 degrees were degrading. Chromic acid samples at 110 degrees had lost 12 stability. Earl's samples, unchanged. Hour 48, the controls were completely degraded at both temperatures. Chromic acid samples at 110 degrees had lost 31 stability. At 40 degrees, chromic acid was holding at 89 stability. Earl's samples, 97 stability at 40 degrees, 94 at 110 degrees. Dr. Harrison ran the numbers 3 times, convinced he'd made an error. The results held. He called Dr. Hendricks at 0200 hours. Bob, you need to see this. The Jenkins mixture outperforms everything we've tested by a factor of 4. Cost analysis. Chromic acid treatment. 8,200 per missile fuel load. Earl Jenkins mixture. 12.40 per missile. Performance comparison. Chromic acid provided adequate stability for 2 weeks under ideal conditions. Jenkins mixture provided good stability for at least 1 month under worst-case conditions. The numbers were absurd. It worked too well to be real. Von Braun arrived at 0600 on October 15th. He read the reports, studied the samples, questioned the chemists. Then he turned to Earl, who'd been sleeping in the break room. Mr. Jenkins, do you understand what you've done? I think I stabilized your rocket fuel, sir. You've solved the single biggest technical problem in American rocketry. You've made storable propellant viable. You've saved the Corporal program, probably saved the Redstone program, possibly changed the trajectory of the space race. Earl didn't know what to say to that. I just used what works on my farm, sir. Von Braun smiled. Actually smiled, something his team said he rarely did. Sometimes, Mr. Jenkins, that is exactly what we need. But now came the hard part. Could it work in an actual rocket under combat conditions? On October 21st, 1951, Corporal Test Number 6 launched from White Sands. The fuel was red fuming nitric acid treated with Earl Jenkins's additive mixture at a cost of $12.40 instead of $47,000. The missile rose clean, engine burned steady, trajectory perfect. It flew 81.3 miles downrange, 6.3 miles over target, the best performance of any Corporal test. The fuel, analyzed post-flight from residual samples, showed only 6 degradation after 11 days of storage in desert heat. Previous tests had shown 23 degradation after 2 days. Colonel Turner's report to the Pentagon was succinct. Corporal program status, viable. Proceed to production. Fuel costs reduced 97. Storage requirements eliminated. Deployment timeline accelerated by 18 months. Credit, civilian consultant Earl Jenkins. Recommendation, immediate contract for additive production and consultation on other propellant programs. But the military-industrial complex doesn't move fast, even for miracles. The Army wanted the additive mixture. They also wanted to understand it, patent it, control it. Earl suddenly found himself in meetings with patent attorneys, defense contractors, security officials. Everyone wanted a piece of the discovery. The Monsanto Chemical Company offered Earl $500,000 for exclusive rights to manufacture his mixture. He'd never seen that much money. $500,000 was 30 years of ranching income. But Monsanto wanted full rights, complete control, and they'd charged the military premium prices. Earl did the math. If Monsanto charged even 100 per missile, they'd make millions. The mixture cost 12 to produce. Earl turned them down. Monsanto executives were baffled. "Mr. Jenkins, you're refusing $500,000? My nephew's in the Army. I've got 2 boys of draft age. If there's a war, they might depend on these missiles working. I'm not going to let some company jack up the prices so the Army can't afford enough of them. What do you want? A fair price for my work, a contract to supply the additive mixture, and the cost kept low enough that every missile in the arsenal can use it." The final contract, negotiated through December 1951, paid Earl $50,000 up front for the formula, $5,000 per month consulting fee, and 10 cents per gallon royalty on all mixture produced. The Army established production at 3 facilities, with Earl overseeing quality control. Total cost per missile fuel load, $15.80, including royalties. Earl's annual income from royalties reached $28,000 by 1953, more than he'd made in 10 years of ranching. He kept ranching anyway. But the real impact of Earl's mixture went far beyond the corporal. In March 1952, Von Braun's team applied the Jenkins additive to the Redstone missile program. Same dramatic results. Fuel stability improved 340. Storage life extended from days to months. The Redstone, America's first nuclear-capable battlefield missile, became operational 14 months ahead of schedule directly because of storable propellant viability. In June 1952, the Air Force tested Jenkins' mixture on their Thor IRBM program. Successful. The Navy tested it on Polaris submarine-launched missiles. Successful. By 1954, every American liquid fuel rocket program was using variations of Earl Jenkins's fertilizer-derived additive. The impact on the space race was immeasurable. When NASA formed in 1958 and began developing the Mercury and Gemini programs, they inherited stable, storable propellants that had been refined from Earl's original work. The Titan II rocket that launched Gemini astronauts used nitrogen tetroxide and hydrazine, stabilized with compounds descended from the Jenkins mixture. Without stable propellants, liquid fuel rockets would have remained too unreliable for human spaceflight. The entire American space program rested on foundations built by a cattle rancher who understood nitrogen chemistry from making fertilizer. The Soviets noticed. Soviet intelligence reports from 1952, declassified in 1992, show KGB agents desperately trying to discover America's propellant stabilization breakthrough. They knew U.S. missiles suddenly had month-long storage capability. They assumed advanced chemistry, exotic additives, secret compounds. In 1953, a Soviet agent managed to steal a sample of Jenkins' mixture from a contractor facility. Soviet chemists analyzed it, found potassium nitrate, molasses derivatives, ammonium sulfate, common chemicals. They thought it was a decoy, assumed the real stabilizer was hidden within, something they couldn't detect. They spent 2 years trying to find the secret ingredient that wasn't there. In 1955, a Soviet chemist named Dmitry Volkov finally tested the formula as given, no modifications, no assumptions about hidden ingredients. It worked. Volkov reported to his superiors that the Americans had achieved a strategic breakthrough not through advanced science, but through agricultural chemistry. His report was stamped top secret. The Soviet missile program quietly adopted similar stabilizers, never publicly admitting that their propellant technology came from an American farmer's fertilizer recipe. Statistical comparison, U.S. missile reliability, pre-Jenkins mixture January 1950 to October 1951. Fuel-related failures, 67 of launch failures attributed to propellant degradation. Storage capability, maximum 7 days before significant degradation. Operational readiness, 31 of missiles in storage condition to launch within 2 hours. Cost per missile fuel load, $38,000 to $47,000. Post-Jenkins mixture, November 1951 to December 1960. Fuel-related failures, 4 of launch failures attributed to propellant degradation. Storage capability, minimum 45 days, typical 90 days before significant degradation. Operational readiness, 89 of missiles in storage condition to launch within 2 hours. Cost per missile fuel load, $840 to $1,200. The Cold War deterrent became viable because missiles could sit fueled and ready, because the fuel didn't cost more than the missile itself, because a rancher from New Mexico had seen a problem everyone else thought was unsolvable and said, "That's just nitrogen stability. I deal with that every day." But Earl Jenkins never sought publicity. When reporters tried to interview him after the corporal's success became public in 1953, he declined. "I've got cattle to feed," he told them. When the Army offered to bring him to ceremonies in Washington, he said no thank you. When Monsanto, still bitter about losing the contract, tried to sue him for patent infringement, claiming his mixture was too simple to be original, the lawsuit collapsed when Earl's 7 years of fertilizer records proved he'd developed the formula in 1944, years before anyone applied it to rockets. In February 1957, Earl received a letter from Dr. Wernher von Braun, now famous as America's chief rocket scientist. "Dear Mr. Jenkins, I am writing to inform you that the Jupiter C rocket, which last month successfully launched America's first satellite Explorer 1 into orbit, used propellants stabilized with your additive mixture. Without your contribution in 1951, this achievement would not have been possible. The newspapers credit me, credit the Army, credit German engineering. But I know the truth. An 8th-grade educated rancher who understood chemistry better than PhDs solved the problem that made this possible. Thank you for your service to science and to America. Please accept my deepest respect. Wernher von Braun." Earl kept that letter in a drawer. Never framed it, never showed it off, just kept it. When his grandson asked about it years later, Earl shrugged. "Nice of him to write. Now help me fix this fence." But others didn't forget. In 1961, the American Rocket Society awarded Earl its Distinguished Service Award, their highest civilian honor. In 1965, NASA invited him to Cape Kennedy to watch a Titan II launch. In 1969, when Apollo 11 launched for the moon, Earl watched on television from his ranch. The Saturn V's upper stages used storable hypergolic propellants, a direct descendant of the technology his mixture had enabled. His neighbor, watching with him, asked, "Earl, did you have something to do with that?" Earl was quiet for a moment. "Little bit. Back in the 50s. I helped with fuel stabilization." "Helped? Earl, did you invent that?" "I mixed some chemicals that worked. Same as I do for the cattle feed. That's all." His neighbor knew Earl well enough not to push. But after Earl died in 1976, age 77, that neighbor talked to a reporter. He told the story of the Saturn V comet. The reporter investigated, found the old White Sands reports, the contracts, the patents filed in Earl's name. The obituary that ran in the Socorro newspaper was supposed to read, "Earl Jenkins, local rancher, dies at 77. The editor rewrote it. "Earl Jenkins, rocket fuel pioneer, dies at 77. The correction honored a man who never wanted honor. The technical analysis of why Earl's mixture worked was published in the Journal of Propulsion in 1963 by Dr. Hendricks. The paper, Chelation-Based Stabilization of Hypergolic Propellants, explained in scientific terms what Earl had discovered empirically. The molasses-derived compounds bonded with trace metal ions in the propellant tanks, preventing catalytic decomposition. The potassium nitrate buffer maintained pH stability. The ammonium sulfate provided nitrogen equilibrium. It was elegant chemistry that Earl had discovered by watching what made his cattle healthier and his alfalfa grow better. Modern rocket propellants still use stabilizers based on Earl's work. When SpaceX developed Raptor engines in the 2010s, they used methane and liquid oxygen, moving away from hypergolics. But their testing protocols still included stabilization studies based on principles Earl Jenkins established. When military contractors bid on missile contracts, propellant stability is a standard requirement, a requirement that didn't exist before Earl showed it was possible. The preserved samples from Earl's original demonstration in October 1951, the mason jars he brought in his truck, are in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum storage. Item number are .1951.0347. Clear jar with handwritten label. Jenkins mixture test sample, October 1951. Next to it, a small card. This mixture, developed by rancher Earl Jenkins using agricultural chemistry principles, solved the storable propellant crisis of 1951 and enabled the American ICBM and space programs. Jenkins had 8 years of formal education and developed his formula through fertilizer experiments. His work demonstrates that innovation comes from unexpected sources. In 2003, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics created the Earl Jenkins Award for Practical Innovation in Aerospace, given annually to someone who solves a major aerospace problem through unconventional means. The first recipient was a high school teacher who'd improved satellite battery efficiency using techniques from electric vehicle hobbyists. In his acceptance speech, he said, "Earl Jenkins proved you don't need a PhD to change the world. You need curiosity, persistence, and the courage to say, 'I think I can fix that.'" What Earl Jenkins proved, what his entire story demonstrates, is that expertise and credentials are not the same as wisdom. The chemists at Caltech and MIT knew more chemistry than Earl ever would. They could derive reaction mechanisms, predict thermodynamic outcomes, calculate bond energies. But Earl understood nitrogen stability in a practical, hands-on way they'd never experienced. He'd watched it, worked with it, failed and succeeded with it for 7 years. When he looked at the rocket fuel problem, he didn't see exotic chemistry. He saw nitrogen compounds behaving badly, which he'd fixed hundreds of times in his barn. The experts were trying to solve the problem with advanced science because advanced problems require advanced solutions, right? Earl showed that sometimes advanced problems have simple solutions if you understand the fundamentals. Nitrogen is nitrogen. Oxidation is oxidation. Buffer systems work the same way whether you're stabilizing fertilizer or rocket fuel. The chemistry doesn't care if it's in a missile or a cattle feed trough. This is the lesson every engineer, every scientist, every expert should learn, and most don't. Knowledge can create blind spots. When you know a lot about a subject, you assume solutions must be proportionally complex. You overlook simple answers because they seem beneath your expertise. You've been trained to think in certain ways, use certain tools, apply certain methodologies. When someone without that training looks at the same problem, they're not constrained by what they've been taught can't work. They just try what makes sense. Earl Jenkins didn't know he was supposed to use exotic chemical stabilizers. He didn't know that chromates and phosphates were the standard approach. He didn't know that agricultural chemicals weren't supposed to work on rocket fuel. So he tried what he knew, and it worked. Not despite his lack of education, but in some ways because of it. He wasn't trying to impress peers, publish papers, or build a reputation. He was trying to solve a nitrogen stability problem using the methods that had worked for him for years. The simplicity was the genius. The modern aerospace industry sometimes forgets this lesson. Projects get more complex, budgets get bigger, problems get defined in increasingly technical terms. When something doesn't work, the solution is assumed to require more advanced technology, more specialized expertise, bigger teams. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes the answer is simpler. Sometimes it's waiting in someone's barn, mixed from components you can buy at a feed store, discovered by someone who never went to college but who understands the fundamentals better than people with doctorates. Earl Jenkins died never fully understanding his impact. He knew his mixture was used in rockets. He knew it saved money and made missiles work better. But he didn't grasp that every American ICBM from 1952 to 1990, every Titan launch, every Gemini mission, every satellite and warhead and space probe that used storable propellants traced back to experiments he did in his barn with cattle feed. He didn't understand that Soviet rocket scientists spent years trying to reverse engineer his fertilizer mix. He didn't comprehend that his discovery potentially shortened the space race by years, strengthened nuclear deterrence, and shifted the balance of the Cold War. He just knew he'd fixed something that was broken, used what he had, made it work. And that, in the end, is what mattered. Not the awards, not the recognition, not the technical papers explaining his chemistry. Just the simple fact that when America's rocket scientists couldn't solve a critical problem, a rancher with an 8th-grade education did. Earl Jenkins, March 19, 1899 to September 4, 1976. Cattle rancher, Socorro County, New Mexico. 8th-grade education, no college, no formal scientific training. Developed agricultural fertilizer mixture 1944 to 1951. Applied mixture to rocket propellant stabilization October 1951. Result, solved storable propellant crisis, enabled American ICBM and space programs, reduced fuel costs 97, extended storage capability from days to months. Impact, estimated 400-plus rocket programs used Jenkins-based stabilizers 1951 to 1995. Hundreds of satellites, missiles, and spacecraft launched using his chemistry. From his own words, interview with Army Historians 1965, I just didn't want soldiers depending on rockets that didn't work. Used what I knew from farming. Seemed obvious to me. Don't know why the scientists didn't see it. Maybe they were looking at it too complicated. Sometimes the answer's simple if you stop thinking it has to be hard.